Hello, and welcome to F1 Into the Barrier with me, George Close, reviewing the Chinese Grand Prix and Marshall's another very successful outing for this team, Mercedes-Benz, who took home a pretty dominant 1-2 on the Sunday after also securing a win in the sprint race. And it was the young Italian, Kimi Antonelli, who took his maiden pole position for the main race. He was the youngest person ever to get pole position, by the way. And on Sunday, he delivered a fairly dominant performance. There was a moment 2 laps before the end, we'll come on to that, where he maybe could have thrown everything away. But largely, he let the others squabble behind him. He can lead from the front, and the gamble that Toto Wolff made in replacing Lewis Hamilton with this young wonder kid, this future superstar of the sport, who struggled in the first half of last year, let's not forget. Has Toto Wolff been vindicated? And the answer seems to be yes. His father was there to watch the win. Pete Bonington, his race engineer, got to go on the podium. It was celebrations all round for what has got to be a very, very memorable weekend. And as I say, it was a sprint weekend, so there's a lot to cover. We're going to whistle through the sprint to talk about the main race, because I think that's where the interesting talking points are. Now, in sprint race qualifying, very quickly, George Russell sets another very good. Now, behind George, I think the main talking point there is Lando Norris managing to outqualify the Ferraris. Now, you see that sometimes in sprint, they have less setup time, but it gave a bit of excitement from McLaren. They're clearly in that 5th, 6th position at the moment. They have the Mercedes power unit, though. Yes, it's not the most stable car. It's not the quickest, but there is something there for McLaren, and David Coulthard thinks we might see a late resurgence from them, by the way. Now, in the sprint race itself, we saw the classic Ferrari good getaway. They have a smaller turbo, apparently, which helps with their ability to put down power faster than the other cars around them. We saw George Russell get a reasonable getaway. We saw Kimi Antonelli, by his own admission, make a mistake in the starting procedure, and he got bogged down and went backwards. And you saw Lewis Hamilton swarm forward, and we saw a really interesting tussle. Very good racing. He mugged him at the first corner, but then they traded lap for lap, wheel to wheel, between Lewis and George. And Charles Leclerc ultimately got past his teammate when Lewis's front left went off. Lewis, in the double stack pit stop, ended up behind Lando Norris, but managed to get the pass done and also find himself in the top 3 for what I thought was a pretty interesting sprint race. Now, I think the main talking point in the sprint race, and it covers the main race, is the mood starting to change on the new regulations. Yes, we're seeing the cars very far apart. We'll see that in qualifying in a second. There is a big spread there. Max Verstappen was almost 2 seconds off the main qualifying lap, for example. But with DRS, there was only one place on a lap where the cars would put on the move. It was very formulaic, and it had varying effects depending on winds, depending on what wing they were running. But with the electrical energy deployment, yes, they have to be in a second. There's one detection zone, but it's way more up to the driver where they deploy it, and you can see some interesting use of it in defense, in attack. Yes, there's been the Mario Kart criticisms, but the drivers at the front are enjoying it, and I know Max is very upset with the new regs, and he feels that it's not true racing because there's engine harvesting, and you have to be sympathetic to that position. I also think he's very upset with the balance of the car at the moment. Of course, the cars are still adapting. The field will narrow over time, but I think that wheel-to-wheel racing between George, Charles and Lewis in the sprint shows you that there is a real F1 product here. Now, not everyone wants to talk about F1 products. Feels very Drive to Survive, doesn't it? But what that actually means, what that's coded for, is more overtaking. And if it's genuinely competitive overtaking, it's not too artificial, I think we can get on board with it. And people are going to have different varying opinions on whether or not they feel it's artificial. Now, DRS was artificial. You're getting the artificial boost. And maybe people are slightly too nostalgic for the Formula 1 of old, where we honestly didn't see that many overtakes. We loved the characters of that era. I think we all prefer the engines and the smaller car, and we would like to go back and trend towards that, please. But without that, the cars are a little bit smaller this year, and the engine deployment is giving us something to be able to see some very interesting tussles play out over the course of the race. Now, qualifying, George had the issue in Q3. He manages to set a recovery lap and get P2, but Kimi Antonelli takes advantage and takes pole position. And Lewis Hamilton outqualifies his teammate. His teammate is probably one of the best qualifiers in the knockout era of all time. And Lewis, of course, of old, a qualifying master. Those two are so close the morning, and we saw how close they would get. They'd even kiss, they would even touch a little Italian peck as the race unfolded. Behind them, We then have the McLarens nestled neatly in 5th and 6th. If they can get the car out to start, they can be reasonably comfortable there. We've talked about that. There is definitely a place in the McLarens. Can they close the gap? Now, Pierre Gasly has qualified 7th in 2 races in a row. Then Alpine, who are looking at some new investment, will we see the return of Christian Horner, by the way? I think he would be spicy for the sport. So overall, I want him back in. They're putting in good performances, which is presumably making their owners happy because they're going to get more money. But Pierre Gasly has found some form this year, hasn't he? Then we have the Red Bulls, who are not happy. That Red Bull does not look fun to drive. Max Verstappen, Isaac Hadjar nestled in behind. Now, I think Isaac Hadjar, yes, they're not super happy with the car, but his delta to Max Verstappen is not very much. So is he secretly happy after so many teammates have been burned by Max? His measure is Max Verstappen. It's not to the front. This Haas, by the way, so impressive. Oliver Bearman, who's having a little bit of a George Russell moment where he's finding his feet in one of the junior teams and starting to really draw attention to himself. Now, for the main race, the McLarens obviously don't start. Both power unit related issues, electrical issues, they've not been super detailed on what they are yet. There's been, again, some pushback against Mercedes saying they still don't feel like they fully understand the power unit. But it's disappointing, particularly disappointing for Oscar Piastri. If you're an Australian fan, I sat next to an Australian today in the pub watching the race, actually. He was torturing himself by watching Formula One without his favourite Oscar Piastri. Now, at the start of the race, we saw Ferrari once again get that good start. Kimi got a good start. George got an okay start, but we saw that soaring forward of Ferrari. At the front, again, we saw that really good wheel-to-wheel racing, that tussle between Lewis Hamilton, who is just on it at the moment, isn't he? He seems to, in my opinion, have a little bit extra insight with where to deploy the energy. You could see on a couple of the lines he was taking, he's comfortable with the car. I think that's the main thing. You're seeing him enjoying racing. And he managed to take the lead before ultimately losing it back to Kimi Antonelli. And we saw that tussle between George, Lewis and Charles. Also at the start, we saw Bottas and Perez with a bit of a clumsy move from Perez. We saw Max go backwards and we saw a little spin from Hadjar. Now, as the race develops, we see again that theme of the Mercedes managed to get past the Ferraris. And George Russell, who had a black eye this weekend, Kimi Antonelli and George Russell, the black-eyed bandit, they managed to start pulling away. And there's this opportunity, though, where Lewis is still quite close to the Mercedes. Then Lance Stroll and the Aston Martins, who are not having a good time, causes a safety car. Now, Ferrari didn't mess up. They did pit. We saw the front runners all pit onto the hard tyres, and we saw Colapinto and Ocon stay out as the hard runners. And they put up a pretty good fight, but they ultimately moved backwards. And we see Kimi Antonelli from that point on manages to break the rest of the field. And other than, as I say, I've already hinted, the lock-up 2 laps before the end. He's cruising from that point. But Lewis manages to get a switchback on Russell. And then we then have another really good tussle between Russell, Hamilton and Leclerc. And I loved it. I thought they raced wheel to wheel for ages. Yes, Russell eventually manages to put a pretty significant gap on the Ferraris, but particularly that racing between Lewis and Charles. I'm so glad Ferrari letting them do it. And it then seemed to be settled, didn't it? It was going to be Antonelli, George and Charles. And maybe Charles had once again broken Lewis Hamilton. But Lewis stayed close. Charles had a lock-up. Lewis pounced. And then it was set. He managed to get to about that 2.5 second gap and he held it for the rest of the race. Now behind, we have Pierre Gasly. Yes, the McLarens haven't started, I know. But Pierre Gasly and Oliver Bearman put in worldy performances. And particularly for Haas. Haas are just such a small team. I can't believe how well they're doing at the moment. If you were to put money on new regulations, new era, that Haas would be where they are now. Crazy. So super impressive by both of them. As I say, particularly in qualifying and on the Sunday, they're looking quick. They're there on true performance. And we definitely are seeing out of the 2 drivers in those driver pairings, Gasly is coming out on top of Colapinto and Bearman is definitely coming out on top of Ocon. Ocon had the incident later on, by the way, which he took responsibility for. Very unusual for Ocon, and said on the radio, yeah, that was my fault. And I felt it was a bit harsh, actually. There was a gap there for him. Yes, because of the nature of the corner, it turns around, it probably was going to disappear. Colapinto is kind of taking the racing line. I don't know. I felt it was actually more of a racing incident, but Ocon ultimately took the blame for it. But those two seem to be nestled in behind. Bearman definitely leading Haas. Gasly definitely leading Alpine. And Bearman is fifth in the championship. Fifth in the championship after 2 races. I know it's only 2. Let's not get too excited. But I think that is just so impressive. And think about how hard Haas have fought for a single point over time. And now they're able to finish 5th. Madness. We then, of course, had the Aston Martin retirement of Fernando Alonso, who shot up from 19th to 10th, by the way, at the beginning of the race. But yeah, they're way off at the moment, aren't they? And it's just not nice to see. It's an interesting Williams. I know Sainz gets 10th, but Williams have also said they can't hide behind the weight. Those 2 teams, I want to close that gap. I hope Aston Martin and Honda can use the additional development upgrade opportunities, the ADUO credits to their advantage, and close that gap. We then had Max retire. I can see why he's so annoyed. Yeah, we have this theme emerging at the moment. We had Bearman, Gasly, Hadjar, Sainz, Colapinto. Nestled in is the best of the rest. And it's going to be interesting how the battle for the midfield unfolds this season, because lots of different cars, lots of very good drivers in there, all trying to make a name for himself and earn a right to sit at the top of the table. Now, of course, we then had Kimi Antonelli, who got coached a little bit by Bono just to bring it home, who had the lock-up 2 laps before the end, but he brought it home. I love the celebrations on the podium. I love the fact that he got emotional, that release that you must get as a Formula One driver when you finally win your first race. Your entire life has been building up to that moment, and you get it. Sharing it with Bono, sharing it with Lewis. He said it was like getting the band back together, although it doesn't quite work as the analogy, as he pointed out in the interview afterwards, that I thought was funny. But thematically, Marshals, I am interested to hear from you. Do you like these new regulations? Because I'm starting to be won over them a little bit. If they can get rid of the engine clipping, I think that's the one thing I don't like, is the engine clipping. If they can figure out a way that you don't have that on the long straights, and you do have the opportunity to deploy this electrical engine, yes, maybe the amount of power can be tweaked, but I mean, we're seeing some great on-track action between drivers that are very, very good at racing alongside one another. I like the fact the cars are smaller. Yes, there are clearly things that can be better. And I want Max Verstappen to be more competitive as well. I want Red Bull to sort their car out, because I want the best drivers racing at the front. So please get in touch. Tell me what you think of the new regs. And has Kimi Antonelli been able to demonstrate something to this weekend? Do you think he's capable of winning a world championship? More to discuss next time out at the Japanese Grand Prix, where this cap is incidentally from. Until then, I'll catch you next time. Another brilliant, brilliant weekend. I'm really enjoying how this is shaping up. I think we've got a very good selection of drivers at the moment of Formula One. We're privileged. There's genuine talent all the way throughout the field. Let's hope we can see some more good racing. Marshals, until next time, bye.